This is StoryBeat, Storytellers on Storytelling, an exploration into how master storytellers and artists develop and build brilliant stories and works of art that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators of all kinds find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on StoryBeat. We're coming to you from the Center for Media Innovation on the campus of Point Park University in the heart of downtown Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My guest today, Peter Telep, is the prolific author of more than 40 novels. His collaboration with Tom Clancy, Against All Enemies, debuted at number 1 on the New York Times Bestsellers list. Additionally, he's written many best-selling novels based on Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon, Endwar, and Splinter Cell video game series. His standalone military thriller, The Secret Corps, was published in hardcover by Ulysses Press. The novel has been endorsed by dozens of Marine Corps veterans, including Captain Dale Dye, who trained the cast and crew on the Oscar-winning film Saving Private Ryan, and he also starred in the classic war film Platoon. Peter also writes for TV, having penned episodes of the NBC hit crime drama In the Heat of the Night that starred Carroll O'Connor, and also the animated The Legend of Prince Valiant. Peter's latest book series is a science fiction adventure following the exploits of 16-year-old Doc Harrison, who wakes up on an alien planet destroyed by his own father. The books have been optioned for a television miniseries by executive producer Bryce Zabel, former president of the Academy of Television Arts and Sciences and co-owner with his wife Jackie of Stellar Productions. In addition to writing novels and screenplays, Peter is an associate English instructor at the University of Central Florida, where for the past 18 years he's taught courses in fiction writing, script writing, and writing for video games. Well, Peter, thanks so much for joining me today on StoryBeat. Welcome.
Steve, it's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm actually exhausted just listening to my own biography.
The bios tend to exhaust those listening to it because they can't believe they've done that much stuff, but you have, and you've done an enormous amount of stuff. What were your earliest inspirations and influences? What was your first creative love, and kind of like what led you to pursue the life of a writer?
I have to tell you, it's a really fun and interesting story. When I was in the third grade at Chippewa Elementary School.
Good old Chippewa.
I was in a class, old Chippewa, on Long Island, New York. I was taught by a wonderful woman named Mrs. Giosi, and she encouraged me to do some creative writing, and I told her I was a big fan of the Planet of the Apes movies, which my father had introduced me to. And so I wrote a fan fiction. I wrote a story about myself visiting the Planet of the Apes and having an adventure. And apparently, Mrs. Giosi was so impressed with the work that she took the pages and laminated them and bound them into a sort of book.
Wow.
And she put them on the bookshelf with the other books. And so during parent-teacher night, she brought my parents over to the bookshelf, and she said, "You may have an aspiring author here. Look, he wrote a really fun story, and I've actually bound it so the other kids in the class could read it." And obviously that had a huge impression on me. Stuck with me for the rest of my life.
Yeah, no kidding.
To this day, I'm still a Planet of the Apes fan.
and obviously it got the hooks into you to want to have more of your words published in a bound form.
Absolutely. And then as I continued my education, I realized I wasn't any good at math. So I excelled in my English classes, and my composition instructor, when I was a freshman in college, my composition instructor said, "You've got some talent here, and I'm looking at your degree audit form, and I see that you're not doing well in any of your math classes. So it looks to me like you have no choice but a career as a writer or an English professor or something in the arts.
I don't know if you've
you're
noticed.
not going to be an engineer."
Yeah, I don't know if you've noticed in your writing students, like I've noticed in mine, but there is a tendency to not be so good with the math and sciences.
Absolutely. And I see it in my own daughters. I have a 22-year-old and an 18-year-old, and the 22-year-old tends to be more analytical and does very well in her math classes. And the younger one is more like me. She's a creative and does really well in art classes and photography and her writing courses, and then struggles in her math. So
Huh. So who were your early artistic heroes?
You know, this is people will talk about all the great heroes of literature. You know, they've read Shakespeare, or they'll talk about the Romantic poets, and they'll have all of these really impressive and just incredible, authors who've penned some of the, work that's lasted across a lifetime. But I have to tell you that a writer who really influenced me, because I had such a love of film and a love of writing, is a guy by the name of Alan Dean Foster.
Oh, sure.
And Alan Dean Foster has written so many novelizations of screenplays. I would always go see the film and then grab the paperback book in which, Mr. Foster had taken that screenplay and he had turned that into a novel. And so that's all I was reading when I was 12 or 13 years old. I was reading Alan Dean Foster. I was reading novelizations of Star Trek episodes. I was reading some science fiction and, fantasy. I was reading all the, the classics written by Arthur C. Clarke,
sure,
and Ray Bradbury, and Heinlein, and all the greats. But Alan Dean Foster really was my hero, because he always took those movies and, lent so much more insight into the storyline. And I always felt like I was getting, that behind the scenes tour of the character and really learning a lot more about the world. And so my bookshelf is loaded with novelizations written by Alan Dean Foster.
Wow.
And lo and behold, I went on to do many novelizations of films, TV shows, and video games. So I try to follow in my hero's footsteps.
I assume,
and no, he's no Shakespeare.
but he made a very good living, I'm sure, as a writer, which is not all
Absolutely.
that common.
And still does. He's written the novelizations of The Force Awakens. He'll be doing The Last Jedi, I believe. So he's still doing. And he's, the original author of Star Wars. Even though George Lucas gets the credit for the novel, Alan Dean Foster was the ghostwriter on that book, and Lucas acknowledges that. So he wrote the novelization of Star Wars.
Well, you were alluded a moment ago to the fact that there was more depth to it. I it's almost impossible for a novel that has depth of character and background to be translated whole cloth into a screenplay, and vice versa, where you can take a screenplay that doesn't have all that depth and infuse more in it. Am I correct in saying that?
Absolutely, yeah. I think in my own experience, I've been able to do like a sort of reverse engineering where I begin with a screenplay and I read it, and then I look for possibilities of exploring the characters more. I look for, other storylines that could run beneath what I see in the script already, and not only complement it, but provide some revelations. And then, of course, the tricky thing about all of that is as you create new material, it needs to be approved by the licensor, by the studio, even sometimes by the director of the film. So you have to be careful when you do that. But it certainly affords you an opportunity to create a much broader storyline. And again, you're always racing against the clock when you do those jobs. But at the same time, I think there's that great opportunity. And I think Alan Dean Foster was able to, provide, for me at least, a fantastic role model in how to do adaptations. And I always had to explain that to people. No, I took the screenplay and wrote the book. My book didn't become the movie, which I would love.
Are you aware of that ever happening, of somebody doing a novelization of a motion picture, and that sometime later, if they ever do a remake, that the book actually comes into play with making the movie? Does that ever happen?
I'm not, but I offer all of my own work to anyone who wants it to do that.
You hear that, Hollywood?
That out there right now.
You hear that? There's work to be mined there.
I have another story I'll tell you about that if we get to it later on.
All right, good. You've written something like 40 novels or 40 plus novels. So clearly you're a prolific writer.
When I started my career, I was writing things under my own name. I did a trilogy of fantasy novels, and then I was hired to do some television tie-in books, and then some video game tie-in books. So I was working so much. And then right after 9/11, my agent called and said, I have more work for you than you could possibly imagine if you're willing to write under some different pen names, because I can get you work at HarperCollins, I can get you work at Berkeley. Everyone is very interested in realistic military thrillers right now, because right after 9/11, we've got this political climate going on in the war in Afghanistan, and there's a readers are voracious. They're looking for this material. So I said, okay, I'll start, working on that stuff. I had young children at the time, so bills to pay, and I was actually, I think, still in grad school even. And so I was still, educating, getting my degrees and trying to make a living and pay my mortgage and all of that. So I was happy to get that kind of work. So I was going crazy with with books. I was writing 3 to 4 novels a year.
That's
a lot
awesome.
of them military thrillers under pen names. So that's where a lot of, I probably wrote 3 different series under 3 different pen names, and that was 9 books right there.
And did you have a military background?
No. And so this is the really interesting thing. When I got the first job, it was, I think it was a book about Force Reconnaissance Marines. The first thing I did was place some ads in the trade journals for the Marine Corps. And these are read by the officers and enlisted. And I was, I have a book contract. I'm writing about Marines. I want to get your story right. I'm looking for technical advisors and people willing to talk to me and tell me their stories. And I got dozens of emails back from Marines willing to volunteer their time, be interviewed, proofread things, check for accuracy, etc. And that was my first experience with the military community and realizing just how generous they are, just how much they want to help. And, all they ask in return is, please get our story right. Just get our story right. And so it's been, since that humble beginning, it's been a really fantastic ride in working with them and educating myself and being a conduit, sort of, And then everyone always talks about the story about Tom Clancy, about Mr. Clancy being an insurance salesman and writing some of the best military thrillers ever. In fact, he practically invented the genre. And so, so I always sort of thought about that and the idea that research can go a long way and that you can become this conduit. And I think if you spend so much more time listening to the folks who do those jobs and getting their stories correct, people will read it and they'll think, gosh, were you a Marine? Were you in the military?
Well, that's why I'm asking
the highest
the question.
compliment they can pay me.
That's why I ask, because you definitely capture that whole that genre of storytelling, and yet you're not from that world, so you clearly had to have done a lot of research.
Yeah, a tremendous amount of research. I was raised by a father who was in the United States Navy and was a New York City cop, so I had that sort of very tough, strong role model. You mow the grass and you do your chores. Hardcore father. And then my parents got divorced, and then my mother remarried a man who was in the Marine Corps, and he, again, another really tough Marine. So I had role models in my life for the military, both my father and my stepfather. But I didn't know the tactics, the techniques, the procedures, the things they say, and then even just things across units that vary. So I had to go out and talk to them. And then I was really proud of my book, The Secret Corps, because I had so many Marines helping me write it that when it came time to go out and get some endorsements, I felt really comfortable. I didn't feel shy or insecure about handing it to Marines and saying, hey, read this. Let me know if you think I got it right. And many of them would write back, holy cow, dude, how much time did you spend on this thing to get it right? And then getting Dale Dye's endorsement was probably, one of the biggest things that happened for me, because here's the guy who trained Tom Hanks on Saving Private Ryan.
Right.
He's trusted in the industry for military accuracy. And he read the book and loved it and gave me a quote for the cover, gave me a quote for the inside, and just thought, he said that I spent the requisite amount of time with leathernecks and getting to know their story. And thank you.
Well, Dale Dye is a legend in Hollywood for all of the military stuff he's done with various movies.
Yeah, he talks about how in the beginning of his career, how there weren't technical advisors. There weren't people that would sit on a set and go, hey, man, you need to get this. We don't do it that way in the military. There were people just looking at other TV shows or films or reading, stuff that was declassified that isn't really that accurate anymore, dated material. And so he pitched himself as that person to come in and advise on the films, and sort of created that whole idea as well. So yeah, I was really fortunate to have his endorsement on the book, and to have had the experiences with the military. And once I started doing these kinds of books, I could call up my friends in the Marine Corps or the Navy or the Air Force and say, hey, I'm working on a new project. Can I talk to you about something? And they've already seen that that my books are a tribute to what they do, so they're willing to invite me in and open their doors and talk to me. So the door is always open, which is fantastic. Because I guess if I was doing like an anti-military thing, that they would shut me down pretty quick and say,
"Oh, sure,
sorry, yeah."
So now you tend to specialize in either military or sort of sci-fi fantasy, and I'm sure there's a lot of crossover for you when you're creating story. But this is heavy action-oriented stuff, sort of really tough guy stuff. What draws you to that material?
Well, initially I just found it fascinating to write about people with dangerous jobs, because I thought, well, you've already got some conflicts there where the job itself, is dangerous. And then I would listen to my father come home when I was a boy, come home from work and talk about stories that happened to him, chasing a bad guy. There was one of his, most hair-raising stories was when he was chasing a bad guy through an alley and had to jump a fence, and there was gunshots, and the bad guy was shooting at him, and he crashed and nearly broke his shoulder, and this big police pursuit. And I always imagined that. I guess that stuck in my head too. I thought, wow, that's exciting but scary too. And my father would tell the story with a little bit of bravado, admittedly, and it made I think a big impression on me. So I started, even in my early works, I started, writing about people who had a dangerous job, whether it's a science fiction thing where it's a soldier in the future, or somebody piloting a starship, something really sort of dangerous, and that sort of drew me to those stories. And I was also thinking about the types of characters who do those jobs, and who they are, and what motivates them. I find that really fascinating. Are they just adrenaline junkies, or are they in it for the ego, or are they trying to prove themselves to someone in their family? The list goes on and on as to what motivates people to do those kinds of, sort of hair-raising jobs. Or are they just very selfless? They just feel like they owe it to themselves to do things for other people and to put themselves in those positions.
Well, I've obviously worked on a bunch of sci-fi myself and fantasy myself, and I know a lot of writers who do this kind of work, and that's the first time I've ever heard anybody explain it that way, where it's about people who do dangerous jobs. I never heard it explained that way. So that's actually opened my eyes to a whole different way of looking at that world, that you take that perspective, that it's dangerous jobs. I think that's fantastic. So do you have a preference between writing military-based stories or sci-fi? Do you prefer one over the other?
Well, it's interesting because I started off in fantasy. Actually, I'm lying to you. I started off writing a literary book when I was a junior in college, and it was a kind of a story about a young man who disguises his identity. He's a poor kid from a small town on Long Island, and he goes out to the Hamptons and he tries to woo this daughter of a rich guy, and he's 20 years old, 21, and so he pretends to be rich, and he's a poser, but he wants to get this girl, not because he wants the money. He really likes the girl, but he's afraid if he tells her who he really is, she's gonna dump him. He's got no money. So I wrote this whole story while I was in college, and that novel actually, I sent it off to a bunch of literary agents just blindly, and one of them called me in New York and said, really loved your book. Don't think I could sell it. It's too similar to some other things that we've got going on, but I have an editor who's a friend, although he only does science fiction and fantasy.
I see.
Would you be interested in talking to him? So I said, why not? If you'll represent me. So I actually went into New York City. Here I am, like a junior in college, went into New York City on the train and met with this editor. And he told me about all the different types of books he was publishing, and that he was really interested in like something Arthurian, some sort of a King Arthur tale, but maybe from a different perspective. Like retelling the Arthurian legend from a different point of view is sort of what we came up with together during the lunch. So I went home and I wrote a book proposal, and I sent it back to him, and he bought 3 books from me immediately.
Wow.
Loved the proposal. So here I am. I've only written 1 novel in my entire life. I've just got a 3-book deal from Penguin, at the time, Penguin
Wow.
Publishers, and I don't know anything about King Arthur. I don't know anything.
Back to the research
In fact, I
grind.
wasn't really even reading a lot of fantasy books. I was reading Alan D. Foster.
Sure.
So I thought, I'm a poser. What have I done? Oh, God, I have to write this book. So then I started going to the library. This is before the Internet. I'm talking like, the late 80s. So it wasn't like I could Google it and get 5,000. I had to go to the library and come home
No,
with,
you had to do real research.
Yeah, I had to go and get my backpack and load it up with books. And then hope
You must
God I
have
got
you
the
must have
backup
read
time.
a lot about Merlin.
Oh, yeah. Lots of stories about Merlin, stories about life in a medieval village, stories about medieval warfare. I got all these really cool picture books that were published in the UK about, medieval battles and warfare and halberds and swords and chainmail and different tactics. And then I learned that during King Arthur's days, there wasn't any armor. How anticlimactic is that? No
Exactly.
armor. It was all leather. Come on. So they were like, oh, should I make some time mistakes here? Anachronism? What should I do? So I was doing all of that research, but we came up with the idea of, focusing on King Arthur's squire and just telling the story from the squire's point of view, and then having fun with that, where, every knight that this kid serves winds up dying in battle. So by the time he's ready to become a knight, he's thinking, this is not such a great job. They all die. I kind of like what I'm doing right here. And so he's trying to convince King Arthur that, he serves best as a squire. This is what he feels like is his calling in life. And now he's kind of getting older, and Arthur's like, no, you have to come and fight. So it's a kind of like a strange story about a conscientious objector in the medieval days. We found kind of fun and interesting. But eventually he has to come around, He has no choice but to fight in the service of his king.
Do you has that been made into a movie, or have you tried to?
No, it's interesting. I've never thought about selling the rights to that, and I really should go back. Those books were published back in 1995, and they're, I don't even know if, in fact, I don't think they're available as ebooks even. And that's what I need to do. I would really love to go back to my old catalog and either get the rights back and have them republished as ebooks. Perhaps there's a number of my tie-in books too that I'd like to do that as well.
Sure.
But no, I haven't even considered that. But now that you've given me a great idea,
Well,
I will.
Well, yeah, it seems to me that's kind of a natural. There's all kinds of sword and sorcery stuff still out there, and Game of Thrones and so on. That's all sort of that genre, of that feeling, that tone. And so, so you've also worked on a few video games, correct?
Yes.
And have you ever thought about taking your work and turning it into a video game?
Well, it's interesting. What's happening now in the game industry is that, the big companies will develop the games from the ground up. And so they usually have a staff of designers and writers and coders and everyone else. So a lot of that material is sort of born in-house. So it's much more difficult for someone to take their novel and step in and say, hey, you guys should turn this into a game. A lot of times, or at least in the past, movie properties would get turned into games. The James Bond series, for example, was turned into a pretty successful video game.
Sure.
And then Alien series as well, that whole Alien franchise was turned into several games, some more successful than others. Alien Isolation is a really, really good game, but Alien Colonial Marines is a really, really bad game. And I teach writing for video games at the university, so my students will point that out to me and say, Professor, take a look at this game and see how great it is, or take a look at this game and look at the reviews and let's analyze it and see why it didn't work. But so for me to adapt my own work into a game is sort of, it's just not quite a possibility right now. But what I've had a chance to do when I was taking the Tom Clancy video games and adapting those into novels, I had a chance to work with the writers of the games and the design teams. And there was a lot of reciprocity back and forth between what they're doing on the game and what I'm doing in the books. And we're begging, borrowing, and stealing from each other to put in backstory about characters and different things like that. So I was able to do that on all of the Clancy books that I worked on, Splinter Cell, Endwar, Ghost Recon. So I was able to work very closely with those design teams and writers. And that was a lot of fun. And the big takeaway with writing for video games that I tell my students is that the stories that we tell in the game are less important than the player's own narrative. In other words, the player experiences the gameplay and has a story. It's the story of the player playing the game. So when you ask somebody, how was the game, they may say to you, oh, I was in level 3 and I jumped on the back of this truck and then I didn't realize it, but I could actually, the helicopter flew really low and I could jump onto the helicopter and fly away and do all. So they're telling you the story of their gameplay. They're not saying, well, the game had a really great story. You see, there were these terrorists and you had to rescue them. No, they don't go into the narrative. They forget about that. That's part of the background experience. So what I tell my students is that we're trying to create worlds in which players can experience and create their own narratives. This really fun sandbox for them to play in and have a story. So that's the tricky part, because the first thing players want to do when they get inside your game is break it, right? They want to mess with it. They want to go against the grain. You tell them go down this hallway, they go left instead of going right. They want to do everything against what you tell them, so you have to be prepared for that. And you can never anticipate everything that a player is going to do. That's why games sometimes spend years in beta testing, because the designers aren't able to anticipate all of the crazy things that players will do, both with gameplay and with trying to sort of shatter the narrative.
So it's interesting what you're talking about to me, because it's still all about a point of view. When you're writing a movie in particular, I'm sure it's quite similar in the novels that you've written, but maybe a little bit different. But in movies, for sure, we look for a singular character with a point of view that we can have the audience attach themselves to and follow vicariously. So we're watching the story unfold through usually one character's point of view, sometimes more than one, but most of the time one. Here in the game you're talking about, that the viewer actually has the point of view. That's
correct. And so there's a couple of different schools of argument regarding the player character and how specific that player character should be. For example, in a game like the original Halo, the Master Chief character, who's like, a big soldier in a suit of, high-tech armor, wears a mask. He's got the helmet on, and it's a kind of mirrored faceplate. So you never see the Master Chief's face, because the Master Chief is every player, right?
Right.
And then as you begin to get more specific and you give the Master Chief a voice, or you finally have him take off his helmet and reveal himself, but now he's 27, he's got a crew cut and piercing blue eyes and a jaw that looks like it was hatcheted into shape, he's the real. So then it becomes a little bit stereotypical. So game designers are always struggling with that, like how specific should we make the player character or not? That's one. And then the other, I think, fantastic option that game designers have is, why not have the player create their avatar, create their own character?
Nice.
And this person will look like anything they want. It's a sort of avatar, right?
Right.
So I can make my avatar male or female. I can give it a voice that sounds like this or that. I can dress them any way I want in this world. And so then you have World of Warcraft and many, many other what they call massively online multiplayer games, right?
Yes.
And
or
so the players have that ability.
They're called mooks.
Mooks.
Yes.
Exactly.
And so it's, but each player is actually adopting a single character, not multiple characters.
Correct.
And so the point of view,
you're still switch. Right. In some games you can switch between characters. I've had my students actually design games where they say the player, in certain parts of the game, the player may choose to switch to this character or switch to that character based on that character's abilities or powers or weapons. So there's that, you can do that. And so the player might be associating with a team, of 3 or 4 or 5 different characters and be able to do that. And then this would be akin to a multiple point of view novel, right?
Yes.
Where like chapter 5 is from one character's point of view, chapter 6 is from another character's point of view.
Sure.
So that's a very, very obvious comparison. Film, not as much. We've seen a lot of ensemble casts in films, but I completely agree with you that I tend to, at least when I'm watching a film, I find my central character that I want to associate with and stay close to that character.
Almost always.
Yes.
And so writing a video game is probably time-wise comparable to novel writing versus screenwriting, which is much less time than writing a novel. Though I shouldn't say that. Typically, it will be less time. I'm sure people spend as much time on certain screenplays, but screenplays tend to be written in, it's 120 pages for a feature. Television is half that or even less. And how long does it take for you to think about and develop a video game versus a novel?
Well, I know the games can be in development anywhere from a year to 2 years to 3 years. It's pretty rare that a company, begins to develop an IP, right, intellectual property.
Mm-hmm.
They begin to develop this IP and have it, from inception to hitting the marketplace inside of a year. It's usually 2-3 years. And for, I'll use another example, a game like Gears of War, which is a big, war game, et cetera. I show my students this behind-the-scenes video of the writers who worked on the game Gears of War, and they talk about, writing 30 or 40,000 lines of dialogue because, you may have on a Wednesday, you may need to write 60 different ways a character is going to say, hey, I found a weapon. Oh, look at that. Hey, now, I'll grab that. Oh, that's a gun. We need that. Awesome. More ammo. And it's just 60 different ways that a character's going to pick up a gun. So the game needs all of those different types of variations of dialogue for replayability so that players can come back on a scene and the character's going to say something different when he or she picks up the weapon.
And that must take an enormous amount of time, yeah?
An enormous amount of time. It's incredibly tedious. So there's, people talk about the art and craft of video game writing, and certainly the storyline development and, what's going to happen within particular scenes is just fantastic and really rewarding. And then there's the very, very, tedious part of writing all of those variations of dialogue and making sure that they'll complement each other. And then getting with the level designers who are going to decide when those lines get triggered within the level. In other words, the player character moves past a certain wall or an alley and that line gets triggered. And then the game knows how many times that player has played that scene and may trigger a different line of dialogue and draw from those resources, those 60 lines of how to pick up a weapon that I wrote. It'll draw randomly from one of those. So it's really complicated in that regard. So it's definitely, I think it probably takes the game writers as long, if not longer, than writing a novel. So the work that writers will do on a video game, certainly the length and breadth of it, I would argue that it's even bigger than the average, 80,000 word novel.
And how long does it take you typically to conceive and write an 80,000 word novel?
Depends on the book. Depends on the amount of research. I can take you through some fast projects. I can take you through some adaptations where they called me and said, we need you to do this adaptation of this film, and we need the book in 6 weeks.
Wow.
So, wow, yeah, and they want 80,000 words. So
but that book, or I'm sorry, but the movie gives you something to go from. You're not creating it whole cloth.
Exactly right. You have the bare bones of the plot. You have the screenplay, and so you can embellish all you want, but you're under a really tight deadline. So you have 6 weeks, and then you could conceivably get maybe a year, maybe an editor will come to you and say, well, we want you to work on this project, and we want you to get it done within 6-8 months, a first draft, or 10 months, or even they'll give you even a whole year sometimes. Or it just, again, it depends on the project. I spent about a year working on the book with Tom Clancy, Against All Enemies. That was both the research and the actual composition of that book, and all the back and forth between Mr. Clancy and his creative team and my editor, and the licensors and the developing people. So there's all kinds of folks that want to read it and have some notes on it. So that whole process was, at least a year.
All right, let's talk about that process for a moment.
That book is bigger.
Yeah, well, I'm sure it is. It's going to be, it's big in many different ways, including in the public's eyes. It will be huge. But let's talk about that process, because I think what you just said is very interesting to me. It wasn't just you and Tom Clancy having a back and forth. There were other people involved in the whole process due to what? Marketing?
Due to marketing, due to the importance of the book, the franchise. When you're doing your own book, you're going to have maybe your agent will want to give you some notes, depending on how hands-on your agent is.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the editor will want to give you some notes. Always the copy editor will give you, and it depends, again, how aggressive your copy editor is. They'll give you some fact-checking notes or maybe some grammar notes. So you have 2 or 3 people that, quote, have a say in the book before it hits print. So it's not a lot of folks to, have to, not very many hoops, and you're pleasing 2 or 3 people and yourself. But when I got the job with Tom Clancy and his whole brand and the franchise, they're saying this is a multi-million-dollar franchise.
Oh, sure.
You know how much money is at stake here. And I'm like, yep, no pressure. No pressure at all.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, whatever you need. How many words you want, and I'll make it great. You got to make them. You've got to be confident, right? You're confident that you can do it. And so, Mr. Clancy had read a lot of my other stuff that I'd written, and I've been writing books for the same editor. So my editor was also Tom Clancy's editor before I got the job. So my editor was really confident in my ability and what I could do.
Is that how you met Tom Clancy? Is that how you got connected, through your agent?
Exactly. That's how I was involved in getting, working with his company and working with all the video games, et cetera. I was writing some of those military thriller books under pen names for the same editor as Tom Clancy, and then he came to me and said, hey, how would you like to work on some of the video game projects? And I said, fantastic, I'd love to do it. So I wrote 2 or 3 of those, and then he called me and said, how would you like to work with Mr. Clancy himself? And, I said, no. And I'm lying. After I pried myself down off the ceiling, I said, absolutely, I'd love to do the job. And that's when, gulp, big swallow, trembling hands, I was making calls and talking to people, and they were telling me, do you realize what's at stake here?
Was this?
And I said, yes.
Did they involve an outside writer because he was getting older and not able to do as much work as he once did, or was he so busy that he needed extra hands? What caused Tom Clancy to want to bring in a partner?
I think that was probably part of it, but no one says anything to you about any of that stuff, and I'd already seen that he was working with co-writers and had done so in the past, Red Storm Rising and other books he'd written with co-authors. So it wasn't the first time, certainly not the first time. And then there was 2 or 3 others that he's worked on, worked with in the past. So I kind of didn't really ask about that, and I sort of didn't want to remind them that I was there. I was like, okay, I was happy to get the job. So, but I made those assumptions, and we did our book in 2010, 2011, and unfortunately, Mr. Clancy passed away in 2013.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't long after that he had passed away, and so I would assume, getting on in years and that sort of thing. So it was a really good opportunity for me.
Oh, for
to,
sure.
Sort of learn from the master and work on the book. And what was fantastic about that book is it opened up so many doors for me, because I could talk to Navy SEALs and Force Reconnaissance Marines and pretty much anybody I want, because I would call up, I'd call up the SEALs and say, hey, I'm working on a book with Tom Clancy. Can I talk to you? And they're like, who? Tom Clancy? Absolutely. Let's do it. So I had that's where it's funny, because an unknown writer might not have access to the kind of research we had, but a successful writer who had that brand and that vehicle and that ability to get that story out and get it true had that access. So, that helped me even after the project. So I saw all of this as fantastic experience for me, and it certainly helped me in writing my book that I did after that one, which was The Secret Core, because I wanted to do the same thing. I said, I would love to do what I did on the Clancy book and do whatever I want, not have to answer to anyone,
yeah.
and spend as much time as I want on the book.
Yeah. So
what could I do then?
I also noticed in a fun aside, I also noticed that that there's a quote from that book that you wrote with Tom Clancy that is actually used in the Merriam-Webster online definition of the word asshat.
Well, I can tell you what, I did a Ask Me Anything. I did an Ask Me Anything question and answer thing on the website Reddit.
Yes.
And they always ask you on that website to come up with a catchy sort of introductory line so that people who are perusing the website will want to talk to you. And so I used that. I said, I'm Peter Telep, author of all these books you've never heard, but even more importantly, I've been quoted in the Merriam-Webster dictionary under the definition of asshat. And I thought, this is my legacy. What have they done? That book is, 180,000 words, and they picked asshat?
Well, as legacies go, it's certainly unique. It's memorable.
I guess so. And it's throwaway line. It's some character that the hero is talking to or something. And it was just, my boyfriend's always grumpy when he's playing Call of Duty, and the next day he's like a total asshat or something like that. And I never knew it was there until one of my own students was, for some reason, on some personal project, looking up the definition of asshat for some reason, and sent me an email and said, Professor, have you seen this? So I went to the website and spit out my coffee. This can't be real.
I would wear it like a badge. It would be like a badge of honor to me.
Badge of honor, yes. And then so I posted it on my Facebook page, and a lot of my friends thought, well, that's cool. You invented the word asshat. Then the story got even more convoluted and construed, and I thought, yes, I'll take full credit for it. I invented the word asshat, which I did not. But just a crazy story. And then the follow-up to that, the other bookend, the bookend that I'm more proud of, I have to say, is that we were quoted in a nonfiction textbook on airline safety and terrorism.
Oh, really?
Written by some really respectable researchers in the field who quoted our scenario in Against All Enemies and said it was extremely plausible, and it's the kind of thing that administrators and safety officials should really be looking at. And I thought, wow, yes. So we made some extrapolations. We as Tom used to say, we just connected the dots between, what we think is probable and what we think could happen, in the future. And so we were proud to be quoted in a book like that. So that's the flip side of the asshat story. There's some serious stuff here. We wrote some really, I thought, well-researched and plausible material, despite the word asshat.
So in terms of collaborations, it's, many collaborations are two writers are actually in a room together. In this case, I assume you didn't actually spend much time face-to-face with Tom Clancy writing, that you were doing it separately in your own home. And that how did the partnership of it, how did the collaboration of it work? Did you write and then he rewrote, or did he give you notes, or how did it work?
It was a lot of back and forth in terms of outline, because there were so many parties involved, right? So that we want to just make sure that everyone understands what the book is. So you write a really in-depth outline, and you get notes, and it comes back and forth that way. And the same thing with the book. And they were really eager to see chapters as we, wrote them. And so I would always take the first pass at the chapters, which I was really glad to do, because part of it was trying to trying to, get a handle on the research, and also trying to capture a little bit of Mr. Clancy's voice as well, so that the writing would be seamless,
Sure.
And so, so I would take the first pass at some of that stuff, and then come back and get some notes and this and that. But I have to say that, the notes that I got, we as writers, there's a kind of an unspoken thing where we sort of understand each other, and then there's the business people and the administrators and the marketing people and all that, and they are less creative or come at it from a different angle. And so there were a lot of things where that Mr. Clancy and I would agree on that they would say, we're not really sure about that. And I'd be like, man, we're writers. We trust us.
And it's Tom Clancy with his approval on top of it.
Right. Yeah. So it was an interesting, sort of way to go. But gosh, lots of phone calls, many more than I thought, was going to happen. It'd be like 9:30 at night, and I'd get a call from somebody who just, maybe a development executive or somebody who had just read a chapter or whatever. Peter, I want to tell you how strongly I feel about this thing. Wow, what we talked about, you really brought it to. I was like, oh, great. He goes, but I got an idea. I got an idea for just this one. You get to figure that. But I always said, some of these executives, it's Hollywood, and it's a big book, and I get it. I know what I signed on for. So I was happy to take the notes, but the notes were good. So I didn't really. It wasn't like they told me to drop a UFO into a Tom Clancy novel or something like that. It was, it was good stuff. So I was fortunate to do that. But yeah, I've done collaborations where I'm in the room at the same time with the writer, which is usually a lot of fun. Especially if you do that a lot, then you really do develop the same voice with your partner. Well, so did it's so much fun to beat out the stories that way with somebody else in the room.
Sure. When you're working face to face, you almost develop a third voice, the voice of the two of you combined.
Correct.
The case where you're working toward a voice that exists, i.e. Tom Clancy or something else like a novelization of a movie, it has a tone and a voice of its own, you're trying to get in there. How much of Tom Clancy's work did you have to read in preparation of writing something that felt like Tom Clancy?
Quite a bit. Quite a bit. That was like the first thing. But, I was already reading the books when I started working on the video games.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd read The Hunt for Red October when I was much younger, so I wanted to reread it anyway.
Right.
And then Without Remorse was the book that really spoke to me in terms of the voice and the character. And it's a big book, So I had that with me at all times, and I'd refer back to it often and look at it and look at phrasings and things like that. So, yeah, it was, and it's a great book.
Did he, at the end of it all, feel like you really captured his voice?
I think so. I mean, I felt really great. And even more importantly, I got the blessing of his agent, who wrote me an email and said, "We're so proud of the work that you did on the book. You hit it out of the park."
Wow.
And that meant a lot to me because I don't know if you know this, but Tom Clancy's agent at the time was a guy named Michael Ovitz.
Oh, really?
Who's the former president of Disney.
And
Ovitz
CIA.
is one of the most famous people, in Hollywood in
Sure.
terms of agencies and the old CAA and everything else.
He was at one time considered to be the most powerful person in Hollywood.
Exactly. And so the greatest compliment I got, in addition to Mr. Clancy being really happy with the work, was Michael's approval, because so critical, right?
Sure, absolutely.
It could have gone south fast.
So okay.
Really
So
happy to get his endorsement on the book.
Let's move away from Mr. Clancy for just a bit and chat about other forms of process. You have this new series, the Doc Harrison series. Let's talk about how that comes about. How did you come to a series that takes place on multiple worlds with a young character, and how did that develop? How did you get to that storyline?
Well, after I finished The Secret Core, a book which took me a couple of years to write, I spent about 6 months on the outline and another year and a half writing the book. And it was like, I thought of it as sort of my magnum opus, the best I could do on a thriller, because I had all the time I wanted, all the access to the sources that I needed, and I got endorsements from, so many great Marines. So I thought, I'm done. I can retire now.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what else to do. And then I started reflecting on my career and looking back at my first 3 books, which were coming-of-age fantasy. And I thought about what my career would be like if 9/11 had never occurred, and if I wasn't tapped to write all of these military thriller books.
Interesting.
What would I have done? Let's look at an alternate history of the author.
Your career turned on 9/11.
It did, absolutely, because I was getting all those calls. I had done mostly fantasy and science fiction in the beginning. That was because I always considered myself this Planet of the Apes geek. Post-apocalyptic sci-fi fantasy, Star Trek, Star Wars. That was me, And then I'd written, this stuff, and it had maybe some military science fiction elements that attracted the editors, and they said, this guy can do military, realistic military fiction. So that my entire career changed there, because that material led to me working with Tom Clancy's editor, led to me working with Tom Clancy's company, and then 7-8 books later, I'm this military thriller guy. And I don't know if I would have become that author. Maybe I would have just been a science fiction writer.
Sure.
And never changed. I don't know, And I made those decisions based on the marketplace, but I was happy to write the books because I was, people in dangerous jobs. I loved the military and was a big supporter of the military, so I was happy to do that. So I don't regret any of that. But I always wondered, what kinds of books would I have written? What would I have done? And then the other consideration is that my daughters are 22 and 18, and they hate my stuff.
Oh.
They don't read it at all.
Oh, wow.
Dad's books, they're boring. Too much technical crap. The Marine Corps were on an observation mission at Point Grid 75 Vector. They called in a helo for extraction. They don't want to read that. They want to read Twilight.
That technical stuff has put a lot of food in their bellies.
Well, exactly right. It's paid some bills, right?
Yeah.
So I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if I decided to work on a book series that my own daughters would actually read? Perhaps even my own students, because I teach college students, between the ages of, 19 and 25 or so. That's the average age. I get a lot of returning students, but, the traditional age is 19, 25. So I thought, maybe I'll do something along those lines. And then I started thinking about the character and thinking about the idea for the series and the idea of what do I want to comment on, because I always feel like I don't want to start off with a theme, but I do have strong feelings about the pressures that my own daughters have faced growing up that I never faced, the pressure of that social media.
Sure.
Can you imagine if you like a guy or you like a girl, and nowadays, if I see you talking to somebody else, I can take a picture of you and post it on social media and say, look, your boyfriend's cheating on you. Look at him with that other girl, and all this drama and all this stuff going on that, and then it's all made public via the technology. And my daughters went through all of that with the internet bullying and stalkers, because I have 2 pretty girls, so we had all the drama. And I thought, gosh, I would love to explore that and explore issues of identity and, people trying to figure out who they are in this world. And I guess in a way we're all kind of coming of age ourselves, changing our lives and trying to figure out who we are from week to week or year to year. And so I was fascinated by those issues and themes. And then I sort of impressed upon myself this idea that I would love to explore those ideas, but through an alien culture or an alien society, and think about questions of identity and how they would affect young people. And so that was how I began to develop the sort of alien culture that I wanted to explore in the books. And then I wanted to create a kind of fun hero that reminded me a lot of the character in my Squire books, or kind of reminded me of like Marty McFly in the Back to the Future series.
Okay, good.
You know,
yeah.
Those kinds of characters I really sort of like, where it's just like, you know, good kid, comes from a pretty good family, average Joe, and then just caught up in an extraordinary circumstance and didn't ask for any of it, you know, but realizes as the story unfolds that he's part of the most dysfunctional family in the universe. And why is this all happening to me, kind of a thing. And then also make it kind of funny. And then, again, you know, explore the more serious issues of identity through the characters and the situations and the alien culture. And so I started writing it, and the hardest part about these books was capturing the hero's voice, because I wanted to write it from a 16-year-old's point of view, and I wanted it to be true to the character. I didn't want to make any conceit that, oh, he's a genius, so his narrative is much more mature. Gosh, he sounds like a 50-year-old writer instead of a 16-year-old high school kid, right?
Absolutely.
So I spent so many years writing third-person stuff, you know, from the he-she point of view about these military characters, and using, you know, all the language at my disposal, that it was actually more difficult in the beginning. I probably had about 20 false starts. I wrote probably 20 or 30 different drafts of the first or second chapter, just trying to find the voice and what it should be and where it should go. So that was the most difficult thing. I would let my daughters read it, and they go, she wouldn't say that.
Did you change the story as you changed the voice, or did it stay the same story?
Well, interesting. I had some milestones in the story. Now, when I work on my military thrillers, I'm a heavy planner. So I write these very extensive outlines, because I'm doing foreshadowing and I'm planting clues. A lot of times it's a closed mystery. It's multiple points of view, so I need to know the bad guy's plan in its entirety. I need to know exactly what the bad guys are doing, how they intend to execute that mission, and, you know, what's their end game. I need to know all of that up front so that I can layer in all the clues and things like that. And also, a lot of times if it's work for hire, the buyers want to know what they're getting, you know. You give them a 20-page outline, they know exactly the kind of book they're going to get.
So outlines are very important to you then?
Extremely important.
Good.
They're always wanting to see that outline, and, you know,
you and me both.
The way we do in screenplays.
You and me both.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any substitute for outlining, although there are lots of writers that don't use them.
Exactly. And so when I did those, I would always sort of, you know, write these exhaustive outlines. The outline that I wrote for The Secret Corps was, I think, 15,000 words and 67 pages. Just a ridiculously long outline for a book. And the book itself got out of control. It was like 160,000 words.
Wow.
It's like 2 books. But I just kept going. I said, I don't care. I'm going to keep writing. I'm loving the story. Keep going. Don't stop. So that was like an extreme version of it. And then I thought, again, something I never do. I thought, I have a general idea of where the story is going to go. I have a few milestones along the way, but I'm going to do something I never do, which is to write by the seat of my pants, to not really know how I'm going to get to those milestones, to try to see if I can get the characters themselves to kind of whisper in my ears and tell me where the story should go based upon their own impulses and motivations and what I've seen, and how those might, maybe even on a subconscious level, complement where I already think the story should go. But I also should be willing to change a milestone or shift direction a little bit if the character, you know, if that complements the character or becomes more true to the story. And I want to say the first 100 pages were pretty scary. I thought, I'm an idiot. I don't know where I'm going. I know kind of what the big showdown may be, but I'm a fool. This is blind. I'm like, and then by like halfway through the book, I started getting so excited because I was getting more and more ideas about where the book should go, and then I started to write it because I wanted to know where the story was going to go. I felt like a reader again.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't feel like a writer. I felt like a reader who was being told a really fun story, and I couldn't wait to wake up the next day and write more pages to see where the hell the story was going to go.
Nice.
So that was really liberating, and I had quite a few days where I felt like, man, I'm in the zone. I'm in the zone. And so, you know, that was so refreshing. And I hadn't felt that way in a long time because I've written so many things under heavy deadlines, so many things under lots of pressure, that I felt like, okay, stick to your plan. You've got a good plan. You impress them with the outline. You hit your beats. Or I could have some fun within a chapter, but the chapter would always end the way I predicted it would. But here it was like, well, maybe he'll say this at the end. Holy cow! I guess we're not going to go to that place. We're going to go over here and see what happens. So I don't really recommend it. I don't teach my students to write this way unless they're kind of doing, more short fiction pieces, et cetera. I know if you're going to write a long work and you want to save yourself the aggravation of, chucking 80,000 words and starting from scratch again, then why not, work on the outline a little bit and have some strong ideas about what some of the major, turning points may be in the story before you begin, and see if they'll hold up. See if you can create a strong enough foundation, and then have some fun and exploration on your way there.
How much
be a happy medium.
How much rewriting do you do? What kind of revision do you do?
Well, I always do. It's the Hemingway method that I use. I think a lot of writers subscribe to it, where you do, however, you set a page count. Like, I treat it like a full-time job. My writing is like a full-time job, and I get up in the morning 5 days a week, and I write whatever number of pages it needs to be for that project. It might be 5 pages or 10 pages, or it might be a word count like 2,500 words or something like that. And then I have to have those pages done, whether they're terrible or not. You have to fill in the blank page. That's the rule. Don't go to bed unless you've done your work. So I'm very, very disciplined that way. And then the next morning, the way you start the day is you rewrite the pages you wrote the day before. And that gets you back into the flow, and then you sort of create that seamless gap. And then Hemingway's trick was you always stop in the middle of a sentence or in the middle of a scene. You never want to finish a day at the end of a chapter. You don't want to open the next day with a new chapter. What I used to do, too, is if I just finished a chapter, I would write the next chapter and write at least a couple of sentences that started that chapter, and I was happy with them, to keep going. So all these little psychological games, little tricks that I would use to keep the writing going. And so I would be revising what I wrote the day before, and then once I finished the entire book, I would print it out and, read it through again. And then, in the case of Doc Harrison, because I didn't trust myself, because this is a new audience for me, young adults, college age, high school age, I've got my daughters reading it, but I sought the help of some neighbors, some former students, people who were the target audience, 8 or 9 different, call them beta readers, to just read it and give me notes and let me know, how do you like the book? They're not writing experts, they're just readers, people who've read that kind of material. I have former students who are fans of, big fans of fantasy and science fiction. And so they gave me a lot of notes. And actually, today I was working on some revisions of the second book in the series, because I just got the final set of notes back from my last beta reader. I always save her for last because she's the most critical. She doesn't let me get away with anything. So I go through revisions with 6, 7, 8 other readers, and then I tweak the book. And then I give it to her, and then she comes back. And I can't believe it, but she still comes back with a long list of notes and reactions. Some of it's just, wow, surprised at that, or wow, really cool, or I can't believe she would say that. Come on.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's a pretty thorough revision process for me in that regard. And then, you've got if you're doing traditional publishing, you've got all the editorial remarks that you'll have to deal with, and copy editing and things like that, on top of all of those things. But this is the new way to do business, at least for me, to really recruit members of the target audience and let them read the stuff, because you really want to have strong reviews once you publish the book. You really want to have those readers, that initial, month or 2 months, you want to get those strong reviews in, because that will help, sell the book.
That's just smart marketing.
Forbid, the first 5 reviews you get are 1-star reviews,
right,
at Amazon or wherever else.
Right.
So.
Well, and that's just smart marketing. You're tapping the audience to find out whether you're actually working for the audience or not.
Exactly. And this was something I learned way back when I got the job doing the Wing Commander novelizations. I was taking the Wing Commander movie, I was turning it into a novel, and then I was hired to do a couple more books in the Wing Commander franchise universe.
Did you know that
Once
I wrote Wing Commander Academy, the animated series?
There you go. I didn't know that.
You
So
do
we
now.
have kinship.
Yes. So, all right. So, you've obviously met and worked with a lot of people in the industry at this point. Do you have one really good, oddball, quirky, offbeat story that you might be able to share that's just a lot of fun?
Well, I was hired to write the novelization of the remake of the movie Red Dawn.
Okay.
Do you remember the original?
I do remember the original. I did not see the remake. I'm not sure too many other people saw it either.
Well, here comes my story.
Okay.
So I loved the original film, Wolverine, big 80s hit, Patrick Swayze et al., just a fantastic film. Loved
Sure.
it. And so got a call, would you be interested in working on the remake? And I thought, well, what am I doing? Well, we've got the script. So I read the script, and it's a pretty interesting script. It's the Chinese have come and launched this really sophisticated sneak attack on the United States, and there's all this intrigue, and it's very similar to the original, but with the Chinese as the bad guys instead of the Russians. So I thought, well, fascinating. I need to come at this thing from a Tom Clancy-esque perspective. I need to come at it with, all of my research guns to bear, if you will. I mean, everything, just pull out no stop. So I take the job, and I spend a few months. They gave me a lot of time to write the book, too. I spent a few months, working on research of, Chinese military organization and philosophy of war, and creating all these really interesting Chinese bad guys for the book that I was going to layer in on top of the screenplay, right? This thing was going to read like a Tom Clancy novel. That was my intent. Right? So as the film is going into production, I'm full steam ahead working on my book. And so I write the entire novel, the entire novelization, with the Chinese as the bad guys and doing tons of research. And I guess I'm just doing my final polish before I even send it off to the editor. And we find out that MGM, the studio, has gone bankrupt.
Oh.
And now the film is in limbo. Like, is it even going to get finished? Is it post-production? Is it even going to get made? Is it even going to get released? Right? So now we're just sitting on it, right? In the meantime, the publisher's already got Red Dawn, the novelization, out there. If you Google my name and Red Dawn right now, you'll see the book.
Wow.
In fact, people on Goodreads have reviewed the book that doesn't exist.
They've reviewed the book that
five.
It doesn't exist, and they've reviewed it?
Yeah. I have some 5-star reviews at Goodreads on a book that never was published.
Wow.
Does that undermine the value of Goodreads? I have no idea.
Yeah, I think it does. I think it undermines the... Wow.
But that's kind of ironic, right? So here's what happened. So the studio goes bankrupt, and then the property reemerges, and they're going to make the film. But the Chinese distributor is all upset. You can't make the Chinese the bad guys, right? You need to change it. So they go back in with CGI, and they turn the bad guys into Russian-backed North Koreans.
Are you serious?
Which actually, yeah, I'm serious. Which would hold up, because the Chinese were so insulted. We can't be the bad guys. We'll never distribute your movie. And I have to tell you, Steve, that on a few other projects, I was literally told that the Chinese cannot be bad guys because of distribution things. I mean, this is just, we don't want them to be the bad guys in our franchise or our book or whatever. So, this is exactly what the studio was told as well. We won't distribute this thing if you do that. So they were under the gun. They had to change it to these Russian-backed North Koreans. So I go back into my research, and I tell the editor, impossible. I don't even care if the Russians support them. This will never hold water. Besides, I spent 6 months researching all the Chinese stuff. It's a total rewrite. This book is a total rewrite. So the editor starts, saying, "You're right, and I love what you've done with this book. This is a fantastic book." I go,
Wow.
"I know." I go, "I know." With all this, it really is a great book. And so eventually the movie comes out. I cut a deal with the editor and my agent where we all agree we're not publishing this thing. I go, "Look, you either publish the book the way it is and you say it's loosely based on the movie, or you don't publish it at all. Because I am not going to rewrite my entire book and make it Russian-backed North Koreans like they're doing with the film. I just can't do it. It would embarrass me. I'm not doing it." So the book was not published. The film came out, marginally good reviews, straight to video kind of thing. And so I sort of breathed a sigh of relief that the book didn't get published. But, part of me is like, man, if they would have just left it, maybe it would have been a much better film, and then, my book would have been out. And so it's just maddening because sometimes, and I've been in a couple of instances like this where I did everything I could, and I did my best work, whatever I could do. I brought everything that I could do for that project, every skill I had, put all my talent into it. And despite that, there are so many crazy things that happen in the industry that are out of your control.
Sure.
A studio goes bankrupt. A new studio says our distributors won't distribute the movie in China because you got Chinese as the bad guys. You need to fix that and change it. And then they just say, well, we put all this money into the movie. We're not going to scrap it. And then they change it, whether that makes any sense or not. And because I'm writing the book, I'm sort of, the protector of the intellectual property, because I'm thinking, people that come to the book are going to want intellectual stimulation from the novel, right?
Yep.
They're readers. So the book's got to be, it's got to take them to the next level. And it was going to take them to a level that was below the film. It was going to drop. It was going to be, it was not going to make any sense. And in fact, a few of my technical advisors who worked with me on the book, who were, reading it and giving me some real technical stuff, people from the military, Navy officers, they said to me, if Peter, if you rewrite the book, then I really don't want you to mention any acknowledgments.
Wow.
They didn't want to be associated with it if we were going to change it to Russian-backed North Korean. So we did the right thing and we just backed off. But I have this really cool Red Dawn book.
Well, that's something.
I always think I have several books like this that either got canceled or something happened, crazy stories like that. And I feel like maybe, if I get really sick and I'm God forbid, on my last days, I'm just going to put all these things out on the web.
Well, it's getting easier and easier to
it.
do that for sure. You could put your own stuff out quite easily these days, as long as you don't feel like anybody's coming after you for it. Then that would be a good thing.
Exactly.
So
like
I've been having a tremendous conversation today on StoryBeat with Peter Telep, the prolific author of so many novels and a screenplay here or there. And I'm wondering, as we come toward the end of the show now, Peter, if you have a particular piece of advice that you want to pass along to the listeners that may help them with their career or guide them towards some better work.
Well, my students ask me very similar questions all the time. How do you write so many books, and how do you remain so disciplined, and what can I do to get better at my writing, or what can I do to sort of become more creative or more disciplined? And I think for the writers out there, I would say the best advice I ever got was from my freshman composition professor in college, who said, a writer is a reader. If you want to be a writer, you should be reading all the time.
Nice.
I don't care what it is, he said. I don't care if you're reading the newspaper. I don't care if you're reading websites. You're reading all the time. You're very familiar with words, with the language, with various different styles and technique, the way words and sentences are put together. So you're always writing and analyzing and just enjoying the language. And then you shouldn't be afraid of grammar, because that's like a carpenter being afraid of a hammer or a nail or a saw. These are your tools, right? So don't be afraid of grammar. You may not know it. You may be struggling with it, but, commit yourself to getting better at it. So that was the best advice I ever got as a writer, was a writer is a reader. And so I never forgot that. And I always thought, let me read. I must be reading and looking at others. And even in the beginning, I would imitate. I would read somebody's great book, Alan Dean Foster, somebody else, and just copy a style or copy a sentence or a paragraph. Not plagiarize, but get a feel for the way that style comes across. And then for, the idea of just being creative and being disciplined at your craft, I think time management is the big thing. I would just keep a calendar all the time. I keep a calendar and I track how many pages I write, but sometimes with marketing or with just trying to move toward a particular goal with either a book or even my own career, I might say, I want to do one thing each day, even if it's just a small little thing, and make a step toward my career, and record that and just hold myself accountable for 3 or 4 or 5 things each week that I'm going to do to try to chase after my dream. Because what happens is that people get complacent and ignorance is bliss, and we fall into our day jobs or whatever we're doing, and we forget about our dreams. But if you open up that calendar and you look at it and it says, day 2, what have you done today to get closer to your dream? I think that can kind of help you and just remind you. So you need those reminders, I think, as a creative. And then finally, you're always open to possibility. You consider yourself an observer of life. You're always listening to conversations that people have. You're placing yourself in experiences where you could take in something that maybe is beautiful. Go to an art exhibit or go to a performance. I go to lots of performances that my students put on at the university, and I'm always inspired, by what they're doing and how they're trying to push the envelope. And so surrounding yourself with the sort of theatricality of life, I think, is, so important. So, reading and time management skills and never forgetting that you can do 1 or 2 things, a week or a month, whatever it may be. You set the goals for yourself toward your dream and writing them down and staring them in the face.
Well, you've given us not one piece of advice, but 3, and all of them excellent and all of them very wise and extremely useful. Peter, this has been a great treat to have you on the show, and I'm delighted that you have allowed me to talk to you today. And I wish you well with all the continuing work that you have, and hope that the listeners will take your advice and use it wisely.
Well, thank you, Steve. I could talk about my career and about writing and about creating all day, obviously. So we'll have to say goodbye now, but if anyone wants to call me back.
Thank you again. Have a great day.
You too, Steve. Thank you so much.
Today's StoryBeat tip. All successful screen stories are stories of suspense. Suspense means that the audience must feel a strong desire to want to know what will happen next. It's the storyteller's job to establish and maintain that suspense. Alfred Hitchcock was known as the master of suspense. He was all that and much more, of course, but all unforgettable stories are filled with this concept of suspense. The audience must be in a constant state of needing to know what's around the next bend. Give the audience what they want, to be kept on the edges of their seats and in suspense, not what they expect, which is easy and boring. Keep the crowd wondering what will happen next, and you might just have them eating out of your hand. And so we've come to the end of today's StoryBeat. This podcast would not have been possible without the generous support of the Center for Media Innovation on the campus of Point Park University. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden, and may all your stories be unforgettable.